Den jetzt kommenden Referenten brauche ich auch gar nicht anzukündigen, den kennen die meisten von Ihnen ja auch schon, Marc Morano, der Betreiber von Climate-Depot, Mitarbeiter von CFACT, unserer amerikanischen Partnerorganisation, wo ich mich auch bedanke, dass Sie uns unterstützen. Mark, I don't know, I can see you. Do you have your Mark? You may start if you want. It's your floor now. You.
Thank you.
Welcome. Welcome.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Holger. Thank you, EIKE conference. I should have a PowerPoint here at some point. There you go. I come from the United States, bearing pretty good news for what's happening in the United States under President Trump. And I think it's having a reverberating effect around the world, including Europe, which we can talk about a little. But President Trump 2.0, his second term, has, in terms of the climate and energy agenda, blown away his first term. And he's seeking fundamental changes that will be theoretically very hard to reverse for the next president. So I title my talk today, The Great Reject, Triumphant Trump Dismantles the Climate Agenda with Nary a Pushback. What's happened in the United States has been remarkable over the last year and a half. And I work with Climate Depot, CFACT's Climate Depot. We go to all the UN climate summits. I'll be talking a little bit about COP30, the UN climate summit in Brazil. We have been on this issue. CFACT was started in 1985, and I don't think we've ever seen a lower point in all these decades of battling environmental extremism and climate than we have in 2026 and 2025. So let's begin. This is where it started that's my book, The Great Reset. So in 2022, I had a book called The Great Reset about the World Economic Forum merging climate change with public health, COVID, to essentially create a great reset of the global order, run by the World Economic Forum, run by the World Health Organization, run by the United Nations. And what happened was we had Klaus Schwab, the president, say we will own nothing and be happy. And so Donald Trump came in and started a fundamental reversal of everything. So the World Economic Forum thought that they had the world by the horns. And when Donald Trump came in, he used, the most important thing he did was flip the climate narrative. In the United States, we routinely hear top administration officials talking about the climate hoax, talking about climate cult, climate religion, climate scam. This is from the EPA, this is from the Energy Department, this is from the president himself, the vice president. And I think flipping that narrative was one of the greatest things he did, because Trump administration officials aren't afraid to talk climate in the media, in public. And it's been one of the greatest things that this president has done in terms of flipping the narrative. So what happened after that was he came in with an agenda that reversed almost A to Z everything Biden had done. He did it in the first 90 days in terms of getting it started, and he's now going for permanence, which we'll get to. So back in 2020, you had Klaus Schwab talking about the COVID represents a narrow opportunity to reimagine, reset our world. You'll own nothing and be happy. That was one of the big, funny slogans of the time. Keep in mind, someone will own something, you just won't be. This is a sort of a return to serfdom, and we're seeing this. They're trying to take away ownership. We're seeing it actually in automobiles. Globally, they want to turn your car into your cell phone. Your car will be something that's going to have high-end software, proprietary, that you need to go to a dealer to have repaired, and independent shops won't be able to take care of it. No one at home is going to be able to work on it. And everything's going to be disposable. Every 3 or 4 years, you get a new car, just like you get a new cell phone. They were riding high until Donald Trump 2.0, his re-election, he had declared the climate fear promoters heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers. And then, of course, the WEF, World Economic Forum, went through scandal. I was in Davos in January of this year for my first ever Great Reset meeting. They had the Davos meeting in Switzerland. Fascinating meeting. The World Economic Forum had just got rid of Klaus Schwab. And it was weird because they got rid of him because he was allegedly spending too much on meals at hotels and a lavish spending, which is kind of absurd when you think about it. This is the organization he founded. So they wanted to get rid of him. They brought in Larry Fink from BlackRock to take over. And Larry Fink is now in charge, the largest equity asset firm, or one of them in the country. Well, one of the things Larry Fink recently admitted was that the AI data center power demands are collapsing green energy. He actually point blank said solar and wind cannot power AI. Now, what does that mean? It means the world's billionaires who invested so heavily in climate scam for the last decades, the Bill Gates, the Jeff Bezos, the Richard Bransons, the Michael Bloombergs, no longer have a financial incentive because they want to make money off of AI and push AI. So this was a huge investment, a huge revelation. So who in America was one of the biggest figures to turn the public against the climate consensus, against climate change? And you might think it's Donald Trump. Well, it actually wasn't. It was this man, Anthony Fauci. And this is an important point to make. We need to just pause here a moment. Anthony Fauci represented the World Health Organization, the consensus of experts. Think of him as the 97% in the world of climate, except Anthony Fauci, the public health official in the United States, was the COVID expert, right? He declared at one point, "I am the science. Whatever I say goes." And people, the sort of the COVID activists or the public health authoritarians, whatever phrase you want to use, had signs in their yards, "In Fauci we trust." It was all about believing in Fauci. He was going to lead us to the promised land. Well, he helped destroy the scientific appeals to authority. For everyday Americans who had never seen their life upside down, schools closed, medical procedures banned, weddings and funerals canceled, stay-at-home orders, vaccine mandates, mask mandates, regulations on every aspect of your life, mom and pop businesses shut, restrictions on all forms of movement. And it was all done because public health said so. This turned people against the idea of an appeal to authority and consensus. Post-COVID, this is Slate magazine, it's time to give up on facts, lay them down in favor of a more useful weapon, emotions, more specifically, the fear emotion. So people who had witnessed the climate issue for 3 decades saw in a matter of days, weeks, and months, the COVID public health scare campaign used the exact same tactics that they had used in climate, except they didn't have quite the subtlety that the climate activists had. They had complete, unadulterated fear-mongering. You're going to kill your grandma, you better stay at home. You got to stay at home, you got to take the vaccine, you can't have a job, you're not going to school. And questioning authority became verboten because it was killing people. There was such a blowback against this. RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a great example of someone who went through this blowback, this transformation. I interviewed RFK, who was a massive climate activist, environmental activist, in 2014 in New York City. That's a still from the interview. He had called for the jailing of energy CEOs at The Hague with 3 square meals and a cot like all the other war criminals. He wanted to publicly punish any politician who challenged the climate consensus. RFK Jr. was all in on the climate scam. Well, fast forward. He then becomes an anti-COVID lockdown activist in 2020, 2021. Because of that, he has a red pill awakening. He now says climate change is being exploited by the World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, in the same way COVID was exploited. Top-down totalitarian controls on society. People see it as another crisis used to mine the wealth of the poor and enrich billionaires. This was a major reversal of a major public figure, and it's because COVID opened people's eyes, and this happened in the United States as well. CNN just did a poll in America, anyway. Concern about climate change is at levels we have not seen since 1989. It's dropped, and that is thanks to the overreach on COVID. President Trump came in, of course, in January 2025, and he pulled the United States out of all these climate scams. He pulled us out of the UN Paris Agreement, which was a good thing to do, but not that significant, because he did it in his first term, and within the first month of Biden's presidency, we were right back in to the UN Paris Climate Agreement. But he started dismantling it. NASA, we now know that NASA says the climate movement inside of NASA will move aside, with NASA going back to only focusing on space exploration. The New York Times admitted in 2025 that climate skeptics were winning the information war. This is significant. Climate skeptics, everyone in this room has succeeded in undermining climate action globally. Since Paris Climate Agreement, climate denial has roared back, arguably stronger than ever. Trump's hoax cheered by a chorus of online influencers. So this was early on in his administration, and people started realizing what was going on. The Washington Post featured this graph on the hollowed pages of Jeff Bezos' newspaper. And this is the last 500 million years carbon dioxide estimate of level in the atmosphere. And they showed where we stand now. Actually, this is it's temperature, not carbon dioxide, but it shows that we're at one of the coolest periods in 500 million years. Not really surprising to anyone in this room, but this was done in the Washington Post. Huge blowback over this, and this actually helped convert people like Joe Rogan, the podcaster. He used this chart against Bernie Sanders when he interviewed him, and Bernie Sanders had no response and just changed the subject. Bernie Sanders being a big climate activist in the United States. The Washington Post said it revealed the world was in a much warmer state for most of the history of complex animal life. This is a major admission. Reuters news agency. Now keep in mind, when I'm going through this, I'm not showing you some obscure blogger, some document, some secret, unsourced, anonymous source. I'm going to show you the corporate international organizations, corporate media, and everything they're saying and everything they're revealing. So nothing I'm saying can be, oh, it's a conspiracy theory. I'm going to show you the mainstream sources that the world recognizes as authoritative. Reuters admits total climate fiasco. The pursuit of net zero carbon emissions has been a resounding failure. Trillions of dollars spent on renewable energy, but guess what? Fossil fuels still account for 80% of the world's primary energy. This was on the pages of Reuters news agency in 2025. The media now admits, in the United States, I should add, because we're in Europe, admits that Trump is winning. This is Newsweek magazine. Trump may be winning the global climate change debate. This is just about 7 months ago. The New York Times did a shock op-ed. Forget climate change. Democrats in the United States, who've been the cheerleaders of the climate fear movement, now need to talk about other issues. The paper of record, the gray old lady newspaper in the the United States, is now telling the Democratic Party, stop talking about climate change. Marks the end of an era and admits, this is key for the New York Times, American voters largely do not see climate as a top priority. I would argue they don't see it as a threat, which is even further showing how much it's dropped in America. Politico, another mainstream corporate media outlet. Climate hushing, the sound of climate silence. This is an article just from 1 month ago. As Trump unveils U.S. climate policy, Dems and environmental groups have grown strangely quiet. Democrats may not pursue aggressive climate action if they win back power. And they could win back power this November in our midterm elections, but they even realize it's not a winning issue. The activists aren't even clamoring for it. The Washington Post, Democrats have gone quiet. It's the big issue they've stopped talking about. Just showing other sources saying the same message. Why have they gone silent? Well, an internal document for the Democratic Party of why Kamala Harris lost to Donald Trump in 2024 presidential election. They admitted that the climate, green energy hurt their election chances. They said climate and energy transition messaging created anxiety among workers in traditional industry worried about job losses. So they now admit internally that talking about climate in an election for president harmed their chances for winning the White House. The European tiptoe. Now, I know a lot of you are saying, well, that's not happening in Europe and we're still full. The New York Times is now saying, and this is, again, 6 months ago, Europe begins to tiptoe away from key climate policies. So I think the residual effect of what Donald Trump's doing is going to trickle over here and has in many ways. Craig Rucker, who's here in the room, and I went to COP30 in Brazil, and this was the Conference of Parties, United Nations 30th Climate Summit. I've been to 23 of the last 26. I can't remember Craig's number, but it's been much higher than mine. He's been going since the 1990s to these annual United Nations Climate Sciences Summits. And I can say this summit perfectly exemplified this whole collapse of climate change. Politico called it the sorry state of basically the UN Climate Summit. New York Times, climate talks end with dire warnings and scant plans for action. So the mainstream media is saying nothing's happening at these climate summits. Well, one thing did happen. It went up in flames. This is an actual photo of the United Nations Climate Summit in Brazil. They had to shut it down for half a day as part of the entire conference center burned up. It was a series of about 10 football fields stuck together of temporary tents set up in the Brazilian heat with massive carbon footprint. They had cruise ships brought in, which are one of the biggest carbon footprints of any transport for people to have housing. They had, and I'll get into what they did with the highway, but Bloomberg News revealed a top UN climate officials demanded Brazilian climate summit, quote, fix inadequate air conditioning, which requires immediate intervention for the well-being of the delegates. This is in tropical Brazil in November. It was very hot and humid. They warned of heat-related concerns. Now, keep in mind, UN climate activists at a UN summit are demanding more air conditioning. But if you listen to the mouthpieces for the whole climate movement, the Washington Post columnist had written a piece saying, I don't need air conditioning, and neither do you. The New York Times asked, do Americans need air conditioning? And the debate rages on, all because of climate concerns. And the same thing's happening right now. On Great Britain Channel 4 for Europe, they're asking openly, should you be selfish and run your air conditioner this summer because of the climate impact? I know a lot of you, this is Europe and Germany, you may not even have air conditioning in your house. In America, I'd say the last 40 years, it's become a cultural thing. It used to be a lot of states from West Virginia, Pennsylvania, never had air conditioning growing up, but as people just get used to the feeling of air conditioning, it's expanding. Remember, President Obama went to Africa and told poor Africans, and I believe it was like in Zimbabwe or it may have been in Kenya, that you can't, if you all have air conditioning like the rest of the world, the earth couldn't handle it. So air conditioning is one of the great demons of this climate battle, but UN delegates are demanding it at a UN climate summit. The other thing that was funny about the UN climate summit is they always talk about the climate impact on forestry, on biodiversity. Well, guess what they did? According to the BBC, again, undisputed facts, they put in a highway to help transport more people to the UN climate summit, because this was a very small, relatively undeveloped city in Brazil. They picked Belém, Brazil to host this. So they actually clear-cut highway, made into a biodiversity scandal for them. And the Brazilian environmental minister actually said we had to clear the highway so we could bring in more people to the UN climate summit to show how we're preserving the Amazon rainforest, which was funny. This was tens of thousands of trees felled to put in this highway. And we actually went, Craig Rucker and Peter Murphy went out to the actual highway and saw it. They had it guarding with military, and you could see the giant heavy equipment still under construction as they did this. And this was a huge scandal, so much so that the COP30 UN Climate Summit had to declare a biodiversity treaty at the end and say, we're saving trees. They were so humiliated and embarrassed. Another thing that was absurd, and this is according to Politico, they sold out of Bob's Burgers. meat, beef, on day 2 of the UN Climate Summit. And we actually went to Bob's Burgers, huge lines. They did not offer insects, which you would expect the United Nations to do, because that's what they've been pushing. That's what the World Economic Forum is pushing. If you remember, in 2006, the UN the UN Agricultural Committee issued a report saying that cow emissions from agriculture were more damaging to the planet than planes, trains, and automobiles combined. And that is what the UN was on record as saying, but the delegates, once again, demanding air conditioning, demanding trees be felled, highways in the jungle, in the Amazon, and more meat, please, meat. Well, we mentioned no insects, and this is one of the UN reports on insects, edible insects, the future prospect. They have been pushing insect eating for decades now, and particularly World Economic Forum, particularly the United Nations. I call the next one the UN's feculent framework. Instead of the Framework Convention on Climate, it's the feculent framework. Climate 30 morphs into crap 30. Yeah, it was a load of bleep. Crap 30, UN demands participants not flush toilet paper in the toilets at the COP30 venue. We were at the United Summit, we were there for the week, and we got this memo through email. You're supposed to, well, I don't get too detailed, but you use bins. Instead of the toilet, you put them in bins provided for their disposal. World leaders went from 6 to 8 hours, according to mainstream media, at the conference without access to any toilets because the toilets failed. Once they got them up and running, you weren't allowed to put toilet paper, which we dubbed then from COP30 to crap 30. And I actually got to go on United States Laura Ingram's show on Fox News prime time and hold up the toilet paper. This was live from the UN Climate Summit. And Laura Ingraham, the Fox News, loved it. She ended up posting just my minute segment with toilet paper on her Facebook page after it aired on Fox News. But this was significant just because the United Nations can't even run a climate summit, yet they want to essentially reorder the entire global economy and organization and our lives in order to fight climate change. Well, they put them in special bins and who knows, recycled them out in the jungle. I don't know. That's a good question. So you have to ask yourself, will it flush before you put it in? Well, the New York Times in September 2025 interviewed the founder of Earth Day in the United States, Dennis Hayes. And he said, everything I've worked for my entire professional life has gone down the toilet in the last 6 months. Well, at the UN, you couldn't put toilet paper down the toilet, but we'll take the entire climate agenda going down the toilet, at least in the US, in 6 months. So that was a significant, I think, revelation there. After 34 years of these UN climate summits, and remember, the UN climate panel was formed in 1988. The first UN IPCC climate report came out in 1990, and the first UN Global Climate Summit was 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which the United States signed on to, which we ratified as a treaty. But this is a chart showing the CO2 levels going back. And if you see, the first one is the Rio de Janeiro, that's 1992. That's where CO2 levels was. So since the United Nations has got involved in trying to slow the rise of carbon dioxide and reverse it, you can see what's happened. CO2 hasn't noticed that the United Nations has had massive carbon footprint, 50,000 people a year conferences in exotic, faraway places every single year, because CO2 still goes up. Reality check, net zero in 2000, almost 77% of energy came from fossil fuels. By 2023, it was 77% of global energy came from fossil fuels. Meanwhile, China's building 2 new coal plants a week. 85% of 21st century carbon dioxide will come from the developing world, China, India, Africa. Still true, and I don't know how long that'll last, but US leads the world in reducing CO2 emissions. We dropped nearly 20% in the past decade. It has nothing to do with windmill or solar, cheap natural gas from fracking. And you can go back and look at the world. In 2010, no one saw this coming. All the predictions from energy institutes, International Energy Institute showed that coal use was going to continue in the United States and we would have increased emissions. Turns out natural gas fracking and technological advancements replaced coal and significantly reduced the use of coal. So the US became one of the leaders in reducing CO2, not through draconian energy mandates of the UN, but through technological advancements. Years of climate action demolished in days. This is Bloomberg News. This is when Trump was first elected. New York Times, the whole world sours. It's not just the US, the whole world sours on climate politics. And we're seeing that throughout Europe to a lesser extent, admittedly. Trump is resetting the climate narrative. This is just an article from last week, 2 weeks ago, about 10 days ago. France dropped climate from the G7 environmental talks just to appease Trump. We'll take that as a win. Why spend all this time so politicians can virtue signal at a G7 summit when Trump's gonna come and he's just gonna make fun of them and call it a hoax, a scam? So they just decided, we don't need that, let's just not talk about it. I'll take that as a win. Washington Post, Democrats going quiet on climate. It's the big issue Democrats stopped talking about. This was a few months ago. Jeff Bezos, now flipping on climate change. His fund is ending support for the climate group amid fears, billionaires bowing down to Trump. His Washington Post, which he owns, editorial board now sounds like it could be written by activists in this room. They're railing against net zero, against the Green New Deal. This is the Washington Post editorial board, a huge change. Now, since a lot of this came out, Jeff Bezos, his wife, just got involved, and now he's committing billions more to fund climate. I think his own activist base and allies are getting mad at him because he was defunding. And so he is putting more money in. And this, I'm talking about this week. This was just announced 2 days ago that he's now going to be putting in extra billions because he's getting, in his world, bad publicity for this admission. Billionaire funding. This is the LA Times. Jeff Bezos' climate fund has only pledged less than 1/3 of his $10 billion pledge. Meta, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg winding down its climate portfolio. Bill Gates has trimmed his staff at climate.org. Bill Gates, it was revealed last year, is funding Bjørn Lomborg, the climate skeptic from Denmark, which is a huge development because Bill Gates has now personally flipped on climate. He's now saying climate change will not lead to humanity's demise. He's warning against the doomsday outlook. He's shifted his views. Again, the New York Times reporting on this. So bad that Al Gore, when he showed up in Brazil at COP30, he spent his time with the media bashing Bill Gates for flipping on climate, saying that Bill Gates was being bullied by Donald Trump. I never thought I would see a UN climate summit featuring Al Gore attacking Bill Gates for being a climate denier, but that's what happened in 2025. Gore v. Gates, he calls him climate retreat silly. This is some of the interviews. He wonders if bullying Trump is doing that. And by the way, just so you know, the billionaire class isn't really ideological. They suck up to power. So when Klaus Schwab was riding high and Joe Biden was president, the billionaires all sucked up to that power and they were all in on the climate agenda. Now Donald Trump's in and you got government contracts for AI data centers and you have AI, essentially this big AI expansion, and you have Larry Fink admitting you can't power it on solar and wind. Suddenly the billionaires don't care that much about climate. They're just not that interested. And Donald Trump has pulled out money. Our nation will no longer fund radical organization. Pulled us out of the UN Green Climate Fund. It's 66 plus organizations, including UN Population Fund, including UN IPCC. He took 300 actions in the first year of his administration to literally unleash America's energy potential. And of course, the CNN reported, and this was a great quote, the USA is now producing more oil than any country in the history of the planet, according to CNN. Highest levels ever, oil and gas production. And this is why I think of all the countries, we had less of an impact from the Iran war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz than did other countries, particularly Asian countries. It's great for the USA, but Europe, and this is according to Unleashed Prosperity, US natural gas exports have risen from 2% of European imports 10 years ago, 2015 or so, to 62% today. The US has now, quote, nearly completely replaced Russia as Europe's energy source, which I think is a good thing. I think you'd rather get energy from the US than from Putin's Russia, but I would argue that you'd rather get it domestically in Europe by overturning the sham known as net zero. So also we have the billionaires. Wall Street has now turned its back on climate change. 6 years after the financial industry pledged to use trillions, the efforts have largely collapsed. And this is a 2025 article late. ESG, environment, social governance, net zero banking go belly up. This is, again, Bloomberg, Reuters, the net zero banking, all of these billionaire Wall Street things set up to fight climate. No one's interested anymore. They just quietly disband, kaput. Even Greta Thunberg has moved on. She's now fighting Israel in the Middle East. Greta's Sweden is retreating from bold green climate ambitions. Energy is drained out of Greta's climate campaign, a broader deflation of green ambitions. This article in Bloomberg went to the school protests that started with Greta, and they basically have ended. There's like no kids there anymore. The whole movement, the whole child movement has ended. The whole youth activism is drying up. Just because, again, the money's not there and the realization, it's a moment of clarity that all of that meant nothing to them. Axios, another mainstream, the world's great climate collapse. The climate agenda's fall from grace has been stunning in speed, scale, scope. I love those three words. And this is just, again, mainstream media. This isn't some climate skeptic, hoping this is true. Politico calls it, Trump's latest rollback makes it all but official. We lost the culture war on climate. Obama advisor, former President Obama, the left's strategy on climate needs to be rethought. You think 30 years of doomsday predictions and tipping points, in 5 years the world's gonna end and nothing happens? You think you maybe wanna rethink that at some point? Trump lost an unprecedented assault on the environment. Where's the pushback? This is fascinating. UK Guardian, and they actually have, that's my quote in there. This is from the James Taylor's Heartland Institute, had a Davos forum, which I went to in January of this year in Switzerland. I've never seen anything like this. Trump is gutting everything the climate movement stood for. This is my quote. And there's been no pushback. So the UK Guardian interviewed a Brown University professor who said, I never thought I'd ever say this, but Marc Morano is correct. So left-wing environmental professors are agreeing that they can't believe what's happening, that Trump has come in and the global collapse, and everyone's just, there's no pushback. It's amazing. And what I mean by no pushback, in the United States, even the Democrats, as I've already shown here, have gone silent. The billionaires have pretty much gone silent. Wall Street has gone silent. Not the UN, they're still talking. There's a few Democrats. Gavin Newsom showed up at COP30, but he was muted. Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island in the United States showed up. But again, no one paid attention. He didn't get much media at all. Al Gore showed up and bashed Bill Gates. But there's just no actual movement. I monitor all the progressive left-wing podcasts in America. Michael Mann isn't even getting on TV very much, no interviews. There's just a lack of interest. There's just not a top issue at all in America, and no one seems to care. Well, when I was on TV, we were trying to get a message to Donald Trump. This was back in November at the UN Climate COP30 summit. Donald Trump, his administration had flirted with the idea of pulling the United States out of the original 1992 Rio Earth Summit UN Framework Convention on Climate Treaty. And there was just no movement. We were now almost a year into his presidency. So we went to Brazil and we said, we have to make this happen. So we tried to fashion it after Ronald Reagan's speech at the Brandenburg Gate. It was 1987 when he said to Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, referring to the Berlin Wall. Well, we decided we were going to go on Fox News. Since you can't pick up the phone and call Donald Trump, we know he loves watching Fox News. I went on Fox and Friends live. This was the morning. This was a morning interview in the United States. Donald Trump always watches this. And I said, in my best Ronald Reagan impression, I looked at the camera, I said, Mr. President, tear up this 1992 UN treaty. Within minutes, thank you. Within minutes, Donald Trump Truth Socialed or tweeted out or posted the entire interview I did on Fox and Friends. And within, I think that it was like 36 days or 46 days, he had announced the United States was pulling out of the underlying UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was huge. I said, pull out, and there's a clip of it. That's Donald Trump posting the video, as the entire video segment that he posted on his social. And 2 months later, Trump guts UN climate agenda, withdraws US from climate treaty that started the whole UN climate scam. This was a political earthquake because if you're looking at it in terms of games, this was the bottom block of wood that was the foundation for 30 years of United Nations climate summits, United Nations climate treaties for the basis of net zero. And if the United States pulls out of that treaty, the theory is, legal experts say you need to have a new treaty signed and you have to have another ratification in the Senate, in the United States Senate, which would be very difficult to get. So that is a huge deal. And that creates a permanence in Trump's reversals. The second punch to the climate for permanence was ending the domestic climate con. We have a thing called the CO2 endangerment finding, which allows unelected bureaucrats in the United States government to essentially regulate carbon dioxide, what we exhale from our mouths, as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act, which even though the Clean Air Act was passed by Congress, never once mentioned carbon dioxide. They want to get rid of that finding, and hopefully that'll stand up to court scrutiny. That's a 1-2 punch that makes it very hard to reimpose the climate agenda in the United States for a future president, AOC or Gavin Newsom. Repeal CO2 endangerment policy. Politico calls it wiping out 17 years of climate policy. Trump has delivered a knockout punch. I love this. This is the media's talking points. When government doesn't go along with net zero climate agenda, the New York Times says Trump is erasing government's power to fight climate change. A knockout punch. I'm sorry, the government had the power to fight climate change? Not to be left out. ABC News, government can't regulate climate anymore. And which my response was, don't you hate that when it happens? Like, oh darn, we could have stopped that hurricane. We could have stopped those floods. If only government could have regulated carbon dioxide. Trump repealed, this is Washington Post, Trump repeals US power to regulate climate. It's like they got a talking point and they all repeated it. But the media still blames Trump for bad weather. So forget CO2 causing bad weather. It's Donald Trump. This is the New York Times. This was earlier 2025. It was January 2026. Sorry, this was earlier this year. They go full witchcraft. They cited an academic in an article declaring Trump will cause bad weather. Quote, Trump's greenhouse gas emissions will cause Trump heat waves, Trump's drought, Trump floods, and Trump's wildfires. This is the level of scientific discourse that they're still peddling in these circles, that we're going to have this kind of bad weather. And just remember, the New York Times also featured, this is about 3 years ago, the founder of the voluntary human extinction movement. You are the carbon they want to eliminate. Keep in mind, there's still overpopulation. They think there's too many of us. It's an anti-human agenda at its core. This guy doesn't want to kill existing people, allegedly. He wants us to stop reproducing so that we essentially age out and disappear as a species on the planet. We want to voluntarily make ourselves extinct. So 2026, climate activists had a moment of hope. They were hoping the Iran war would go on indefinitely. The Strait of Hormuz would stay closed. Iran energy stocks part global push to reduce fossil fuel. There was a whole movement, World Health and International Energy Agency, pushing sort of Iran war energy lockdowns. They saw an opportunity. They were so excited. Working from home, driving slower, flying less. But of course, hopefully the war ends and they don't get to have their fantasy. This was some of the international energy COVID-style lockdowns they were proposing. They had a moment of hope about a month into the war, but it didn't materialize. Iran war equals climate lockdown. Top Brussels official urges Europeans to work from home. So they were really hopeful that we'd have a global energy collapse due to the war. They love a crisis. Science getting more and more desperate. This was a study out of the UK. At the end of 2023, humans are fueling global warming just by breathing. It was in a peer-reviewed journal. And the gist of it is, I think it was women have more hot air than men. And certain ethnic groups like Asians have more hot air than Africans. They were breaking it in by identity politics. It was absurd stuff. But this is the kind of, what we exhale from our mouth is now considered a pollutant and causing global warming. UN warns, this is some recent stuff. World Cup, everyone, I think it was congratulations to Germany, by the way. I think they just won, but UN warns World Cup players run slower due to the climate. So the UN is still involved in the science. UN Climate Agency warns of slower games due to extreme heat. They said the games will be played with rising levels of heat worsened and the pace of the match could be slower. So you had a UN climate official saying that people watching the World Cup are going to see slow players. But hold on, it gets worse, because ABC News is reporting that World Cup fans, not only will they be watching slow players, they're going to be drinking more because you tend to drink more in the heat, and alcohol affects you more in the heat than it would in less heat. So sorry, let me go back. You end up with the scenario of people extra drunk, extra hungover, extra out of it with beer goggles watching really slow players. And they also call the World Cup a climate catastrophe because it's the largest carbon footprint World Cup in the history of World Cups. This was in a peer-reviewed study in 2025, last summer, not even a year ago. Not making this up, beneficial blood-sucking bioethicists want ticks to infect people to stop them from eating meat. We have a thing called the Lone Star tick, where one of the reactions is you get an allergy to red meat. If eating meat is morally impermissible, the efforts to prevent the spread of tick-borne allergies are also morally impermissible. Published in the journal Bioethics. So, while I'm declaring a big victories here in the climate world, this is frightening stuff here. This is a peer-reviewed journal, Journal of Bioethics, promoting the idea that we shouldn't stop ticks from infecting people and giving them meat allergies. Why? Because meat allergies mean people eat less meat, which is good for the climate. What scare is next? Well, Paul Ehrlich just died this year. Anyone want a moment of silence? I don't want to disrespect the dead, but anyway. Paul Ehrlich, now that he's dead, now they finally come out, a new journal study, scientists predict global population crash by 2064. Humanity potentially halved. So the new scare is underpopulation. You can't keep track of this. And Paul Ehrlich's out of the way, so they don't have to worry about him objecting. So that's incredible that they come out with this one now. 2024, the only true climate prediction, the election of Donald Trump could put world's climate goals at risk. I'd say that's happened, and I think that's one true prediction. The Guardian can take credit for that one. So here's what's, and to end, summary of who and what is harming the climate movement. Overreach on COVID, appeal to authority, has ruined that appeal. You can no longer cite the 97% and convince people, because people know what happened during COVID. Trump flipping the narrative and his decisive action. AI data centers need fossil fuels and nuclear, so solar and wind are no longer viable to the power structure. Decades of failed predictions about green energy taking over. 80% of our energy still comes from fossil fuels now. 80% came 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I've seen it go back to 1920. 80% of the energy still came from fossil fuels. And the burnout of the climate activist message. Even Greta moved on. There's just not that much interest in this doomsday scenario. So the Great Reset became the Great Resist, the Great Reject, and that's where we are right now. I think this has to be a celebratory moment. Even if you're not happy with what's happening in Europe, there are residual effects spreading. We have to take a moment to celebrate where we are at this moment. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take Q&A. Thanks. Thank you. Oh, hey.